My name is Kelsey. I'm 29 years old. A few weeks ago, my father accidentally sent me a video that left no room for doubt about my place in my family. I had just gotten home from a late shift, still in my scrubs, when my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a video notification from him. I tapped it automatically, expecting something small, maybe a funny clip or a home video, but what played was anything but innocent. The image wavered, as if the camera had been set on a table. I could see part of the couch, the edge of the coffee table, and the shadowy forms of people sitting nearby. I didn't need to see their faces, I knew their voices instantly. The first sound was my name, followed by laughter, then my father's voice, calm in a way it never was over the phone, calling me a pathetic failure. Another voice added that I should feel lucky to be useful at all, because at least I paid everyone's bills. They were laughing about it. For years I had been covering rent, utilities, and emergencies, and apparently that made me nothing more than a source of convenience. Then, just as my father leaned closer to the camera, the video cut. The chat reset like nothing had happened. I didn't respond. I just stared out the dark kitchen window, a strange mix of shock and clarity settling in. I decided not to argue, not to cry, not to explain. I would wait. The next payment was due soon, and that's when everything would truly begin. By the next morning, the usual pressure from home had already crept back. It was familiar in its weight, like muscle memory, a rhythm I had ignored until it became unbearable. The deadlines, bills, and emergencies had been my responsibility for years, and I had accepted it as part of life. When I moved out to Oregon and started my own job, the demands didn't decrease, they multiplied. My parents' and sisters' crises always took precedence. My mom, Denise, had a pattern. She would start conversations with warmth, soft words meant to cushion the incoming request, but soon she'd pivot to reminders and expectations, each one sharper than the last. My father, Mark, rarely spoke, but his silence was equally commanding. It implied that I should handle everything without a word. My sister Sierra was even more direct, sending short, urgent messages that assumed the world would collapse if I didn't act instantly. Each notification hit harder now, not because the tone had changed, but because I finally understood the expectation behind it. Despite that, the reflex to fix everything still rose inside me. I found myself calculating numbers, rearranging budgets, running through possible solutions. But then I realized something I hadn't let myself acknowledge before. I couldn't keep doing this. Not financially, not emotionally, not while pretending their demands were love. The truth was clear. As the next payment approached, I typed a message that felt alien in its simplicity. No apologies, no justifications, no cushioning, just a statement of my decision. Sending it brought a quiet steadiness I hadn't known in years. Soon after, a voice message appeared from my Aunt Valerie. I knew her well. She rarely contacted me unless she wanted to influence the family dynamic. Her voice started soft, melodic, almost caring, but soon shifted to subtle reproach, blending disappointment with amusement, as if my refusal were childish. She spoke about family history, sacrifices, and loyalty, implying that my refusal was a betrayal. The message ended with a warning disguised as compassion, boundaries, resentment, and consequences, all framed as concern. I didn't replay it or respond. I muted the thread and removed it from view. For the first time, the pressure didn't sink into me. It stayed distant, like noise I didn't need to absorb. I knew the boundaries I'd drawn would be tested, but I also knew I had finally shown a version of myself they had never encountered. Someone who could say no. By the weekend, the tension was palpable. A firm knock at the door revealed Sierra, drenched from Oregon rain, barging in as though it were her right. She didn't ask to enter, she assumed it. I watched her take in the quiet order of my home, the space I had carefully curated for myself. Her presence was sharp, her voice tight with urgency and frustration. She didn't seek understanding, she came to correct. Her certainty that I would bend clashed with the new clarity I had found. I spoke calmly, firmly, and asked her to leave. She paused, searching for a crack, then left, the storm inside her flashing briefly before the door closed. The quiet that followed wasn't empty, it was solid, grounded mine. Later, the calls from my parents arrived, carrying the same strategies I had known for years. My father's clipped, authoritative tone demanded explanations, my mother's trembling words sought to disarm me. I let them speak, then responded simply, no payment. The silence that followed was different, it was a boundary. No more manipulation, no more guilt, no more default obedience. I called the landlord, Mr. Collins, and ended my responsibility for their rent, confirming future billing went directly to them. Watching automatic transfers disappear from my account felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I hadn't realized I had surrendered. My father sent one final message, assigning me full blame for any fallout. I didn't respond. The stillness afterward was honest, a strange kind of freedom. Weeks passed. The consequences of my decision started unfolding naturally. Mr. Collins called about late fees and unpaid rent. Neighbors mentioned raised voices and stress at home. Social media hinted at my sister selling her car and my parents seeking small loans. None of this required my involvement anymore. The responsibility I had carried alone for years had returned to its rightful place. Hearing about it didn't stir guilt. It reinforced how much I had given, and how firmly I had chosen to reclaim my life. The quiet I now lived in was steady, grounded, and finally mine. Over the following weeks, life felt strangely different. Without the constant tug of responsibility for their household, I started noticing small freedoms I had long ignored. My mornings no longer carried the silent weight of calculating numbers, of preparing for emergencies that weren't mine to solve. Even the act of paying my own bills felt lighter, uncomplicated. Yet the world outside wasn't quiet. Updates about my family continued to filter in, like fragments of a life I had once been chained to. Posts from Sierra hinted at struggles I used to fix instantly. Conversations I overheard from mutual friends spoke of arguments and tension at home. My parents' frantic packing and whispered complaints now arrived at my ears, filtered through distance, devoid of the immediacy they once carried. I listened only to understand the reality, not to intervene. Some days the temptation to step back in returned. Old habits die slowly. I found myself imagining ways to smooth things over, balancing budgets in my mind, worrying about late fees, plotting how to avoid another argument. Each time I stopped myself, I realized the habit had less to do with care and more to do with years of conditioned expectation. My energy, my attention, my stability, they were mine, not theirs. It was a strange adjustment, learning to honor that. My boundaries became a quiet force, one that didn't announce itself with shouting or confrontation, but existed simply because I allowed it. And in that quiet, I began to rebuild a sense of self that had been obscured by years of obligation. Sierra tried again, subtly, over texts and phone calls. The urgency remained, now punctuated with hints of frustration and incredulity. She suggested consequences, implied chaos, and even attempted manipulation by claiming crises I had no way of verifying. Each time I paused, I read her messages, acknowledged them silently, but refused to respond in the way I once would have. I had learned that silence maintained firmly was a statement as clear as any argument I could make. Slowly the pattern shifted. The storm she carried no longer dictated my calm. Her certainty that I would bend faded against the steady boundary I had drawn. At work and in my personal life, I felt changes ripple outward. Simple choices, buying groceries without calculating their impact on an imaginary household, planning evenings without worry about calls from home, took on a weight of relief I hadn't realized I craved. The anxiety that had been my constant companion for years began to dissolve, replaced by a strange, unfamiliar confidence. I was no longer a shadow moving at the edges of their lives. I was visible, present for myself, and grounded in decisions that served my well-being first. That clarity, I realized, was both liberating and terrifying. Liberation came with consequences. I had severed the invisible umbilical cord that had tied me to their expectations, and though the tug of guilt tried to return at times, it no longer held sway. One afternoon I received a brief note from my father, a text stripped of the usual warmth or blame. "Things are different now." I didn't reply. The message was neither a threat nor an apology. It was acknowledgement of a shift of boundaries that could no longer be ignored. I felt no anger, only a quiet sense of finality. Life at home, chaotic and dependent as it remained, was theirs to manage. My life, orderly in the ways I chose, was mine to live. For the first time I felt fully responsible only for myself, and in that responsibility I discovered something I hadn't expected: freedom. The ongoing waves of tension from my family still existed, but they now travelled in a current I could watch without drowning in. And in that space I could finally breathe uninterrupted, and know that the choices I made were mine, not demanded, not expected, and not negotiable. Weeks turned into months, and the quiet I had claimed for myself began to solidify into something almost tangible. Each morning, waking without the gnawing dread of immediate family emergencies felt revolutionary. I started noticing subtle things about my home I hadn't before: the way sunlight hit the hardwood floor just right, the small stack of books I had abandoned during long nights of calculating bills, the faint hum of life in my own apartment that was entirely my own. For the first time, I could plan my days around myself, not their needs, not their crises. Even the simplest decisions carried a weight of freedom I hadn't recognized until it was present. What to cook, when to sleep, whether to take a walk or meet a friend. I had reclaimed hours that used to vanish under the shadow of their demands. The updates from home kept trickling in, but I engaged differently now. Social media posts from Sierra revealed mounting frustrations, her certainty about my obligations now clashing with reality. Snippets about delayed bills, frantic phone calls, and even her attempts to sell personal possessions to cover expenses filtered through mutual friends and distant neighbors. My parents, Mark and Denise, seemed to wobble under their own self-created pressure. Friends and acquaintances passed me updates with curiosity rather than urgency, assuming I was still the one holding everything together. But I was no longer a shadow in their lives. I was observing from a distance, understanding without being entangled, and for the first time, I could assess the situation with clarity instead of panic. Sierra's attempts at control became more transparent over time. She sent messages cloaked in concern, guilt, and hints of chaos, trying to bait me into the familiar reflex of immediate action. Each time I paused, measured my response, and realized the power I had in simply not responding. My silence was no longer a void, it was a statement. It was firm, steady, and impossible to misinterpret. I would no longer act out of obligation alone. Her certainty that I would bend, that the sister who had always carried the weight would do so again, began to crumble as I refused to feed it. In observing her frustration, I began to see patterns I had never allowed myself to notice before. Her entitlement, the automatic assumption that I existed to stabilize her world, and the deep insecurity masked behind urgency and accusation. At work, the change was subtle but profound. My focus sharpened, my creativity returned, and the constant background anxiety that had been the soundtrack of my adult life began to fade. Tasks I once approached with tension were now handled with calm. Decisions felt less like calculations to prevent disasters and more like expressions of choice. Evenings I had spent obsessing over what calls or messages I might receive from home were now mine to shape. I started pursuing hobbies I had neglected, reconnecting with friends, and allowing myself to experience life outside the framework of their crises. It was a strange, liberating sensation to feel the full weight of autonomy without guilt pressing on my shoulders. Then came a turning point. One afternoon my phone buzzed with a short, clipped message from my father. "You've chosen, things will follow." I didn't respond. The phrasing, cold and factual, wasn't new, but its context had changed. I was no longer responding from fear or habit. I read the message, acknowledged it silently, and went about my day. The emotional weight it carried for years was gone. I realized that my compliance had never truly protected me or made the household stable. It had only tethered me to their expectations. And with that tether cut, a strange clarity settled over my life. The responsibility for their chaos belonged fully to them. My mother, Denise, tried the familiar rhythm next. A voice message arrived, soft and tentative at first, laced with worry and subtle attempts to disarm me. She painted scenarios of instability, implying crises that required my immediate attention. But the calm that had begun to root itself in me prevented my old reflex from rising. I listened, recognized the manipulation for what it was, and let it pass. Her voice, filled with the same patterns I had lived under for years, no longer had the power to dictate my choices. I felt an unexpected sense of compassion, not for the crises she described, but for the realization that she too was bound by the habits and expectations of our family dynamic. I didn't need to fix it, I only needed to exist outside of it. Sierra escalated next, appearing at my door unannounced once again, soaked by rain and trembling with urgency. Her eyes searched for hesitation, for the familiar reflex she had exploited so often, but I was firm, calm, and unyielding. I told her simply that my decision was final and that I needed her to leave. Her face flashed between disbelief and frustration as she turned away. For the first time, I realized that confrontation didn't have to be dramatic or loud to be effective. Boundaries could exist quietly and yet carry unshakable weight. The storm she carried left with her, and the stillness she left behind was mine to inhabit, fully and without guilt. Weeks continued to pass, marked by the subtle shifts that came from sustained boundaries. Messages from my family arrived sporadically, each carrying the familiar undertone of expectation, but each now met with silence or calm acknowledgement. The landlord, Mr. Collins, provided updates on late payments and consequences, but I no longer felt the compulsion to intervene. Hearing the news of their struggles no longer induced guilt or panic. It was simply information, detached from my responsibility. Friends and neighbors occasionally shared observations, yet I no longer felt pressure to act. The world I had carried alone for so long was now firmly their responsibility, and the space I had carved out for myself was expanding in ways I hadn't imagined possible. One evening, sitting in my living room with the faint hum of the city outside, I reflected on the shift. Years of unacknowledged labor, financial, emotional, logistical, had shaped my early adulthood. The reflex to manage, to stabilize, to fix, had been ingrained so deeply that I hadn't realized it was never truly mine to bear. Releasing that weight had been terrifying at first. There were moments of doubt, fear of consequences, and flashes of guilt. But with each passing day of quiet autonomy, I felt the power of choice settle in. I could plan without fear, act without compulsion, and prioritize without apology. For the first time, I was fully, undeniably myself. The freedom brought new responsibilities, not to anyone else but to myself. I began setting goals, small at first, an extra hour of sleep, a dinner with a friend, a weekend away without checking in. Then bigger ones, saving for a trip I had dreamed of for years, pursuing a professional opportunity I had postponed, taking care of my mental and emotional well-being in ways that weren't just reactive, but proactive. The tension from my family no longer dictated my pace or choices. I observed, understood, and maintained distance. Each day, the old patterns of obligation weakened, replaced by clarity, resilience, and self-possession. It was not easy. Boundaries are rarely unchallenged. There were moments when guilt tried to creep back in, messages that implied disappointment, threats disguised as concern, or attempts to manipulate through subtle reminders of shared history. Each time I paused, assessed, and chose to respond from a place of calm rather than compulsion. And each time I discovered the truth I had always needed. My life, my energy, my time, those belonged to me. The consequences of saying no were theirs to manage. The freedom I gained, finally unmediated by obligation or guilt, was profound. I could live without their expectations dictating my worth, and in that space I began to thrive. Months later, the chaos at home continued as it always had. My parents struggled to manage bills, disputes arose, and Sierra's certainty about my role persisted in occasional messages and fleeting appearances. But none of it reached me the way it once had. I had anchored myself in boundaries, in clarity, and in a steady understanding of my limits. For the first time, I existed outside the cycle of obligation. I could love, observe, and engage without being swallowed by expectation. I could be Kelsey, fully, unapologetically, and entirely responsible only for the life I chose to live. And in that realization, a quiet, unwavering power settled inside me, a power I had been denied for years but would never surrender again.